we've got the recorder on. And why don't we just go directly into the reporting and start with breakout room number 1.
Okay, I think that was us. Thanks, Bob. We had a fabulous group. I was calling them the All-Stars. There are a lot of really exemplary water activists and advocates in our group, and covered so much it's going to be hard for me to pull my thoughts together this quickly. But one major theme that came out of our group was that that shortage sharing or water sharing, sometimes it's helpful to think of shortage sharing. That it should, the one way it could be more equitable is that it's not just a practice that's done by surface water users, but that there be an equitable approach that's across the board between rural and urban, so that the messaging is getting across to everybody in a similar way, so that our policymakers aren't telling farmers you shouldn't plant anything this year, but also that urban users are being told this is a really critical year. We all need to cut back on the water we're using. And we talked about the surface and groundwater equity, especially in the middle of Rio Grande, that the Water Utility Authority, when there's less surface water, shifts to more groundwater and went from 30,000 acre feet a year to 70,000 acre feet a year in a very short amount of time. And so one of our participants also pointed out that there's a gallon to gallon relationship between pumping out of the aquifer and what's in the river. And so, the long-term impact is that the more we pull out of the aquifer, the more it's going to also affect the river. And also, on the flip side of that, we talked about the importance of the agricultural lands as being recharge areas, and that if those are in need of protection because they're contributing to aquifer recharge, and yet they're under great threat. And that when they're developed, there's a double whammy, because not only are we losing the aquifer recharge potential, but then they start to become a groundwater user, and you're doing a double the damage to the overall system, the overall water commons. One of the really interesting comments that was made was that shared sacrifice, and that the word sacrifice shares the same root with sacred, and that having a water ethic that treats water as sacred is really important for everyone who cares about water as a commons that connects all of us, that it's not a siloed thing, that everyone should care about the water in a similar way. There was much more that we talked about. We talked about the equity problems with water transfers and water leases, and how the commodification of water is in essence a very inequitable practice, because and it's an inequitable policy framework because of the fact that most of the entities that acquire water have more resources than the people who are affected by the water transfers and then have to protest or otherwise get involved. And we talked about the inadequate consideration the state engineer gives to public welfare and conservation, and not even having a thorough impairment analysis, and that was a big equity issue as well. So we covered a lot of ground, but I will stop there and turn it over to the next person, unless someone wants to weigh in from our group, because we had a really excellent group. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, let's go to number 2.
All right, that would be Ralph is going to give that overview of what we talked about. We had an excellent, just as Paula had said, we had an excellent group. We had southern perspective, northern perspective, small farmers perspective, ecosystem concerns, rural water systems purveyor. Anyhow, lots of good input. And we had our NGOs represented as well. One of the main concerns that came out was that, and I'm paraphrasing, but deep pockets can move into a community and then dig deep wells. And those that are surface water users are left, out in left field in terms of being able to make sure that their small farm needs are being met. And they've been living, they just want to have a sustainable, food future for themselves, but they get short shrift. Now it all brings up is food insecurity was another concern that was raised. That's going to be a reality going into the near future. Climate change is going to force discussions on the need for change in water management and water distribution. Another one that was expressed is the fact that we need our water data, and if some reports that were developed in the past have been put on the shelf and they're no longer available, that is very discouraging. So we need to make sure that we have all water data accounted for, that we have water monitoring, maybe some new water monitoring. We need to have a significant new study of our water resources so we can make effective decisions going into the future. I'll try to take a couple other snapshots of things in here that I may not have touched on, because like Paul says, it's kind of hard to get these things all assimilated. One question, in New Mexico, we have only 4 people overseeing over 400 water projects. It turns out that they can't even validate the invoices that are being submitted. So there's a concern that is the work being done and is it being overcharged? A heavy theme that came out of this is the fact that we know that our agencies are underfunded and understaffed, and there needs to be a realization of our decision makers that they need to act on this big. And then final thing I'll conclude with was the need for education. We think that the public and our decision makers have been for too long taking water for granted, and we need to make it known to the public and the decision makers that an urgent need to act on our statewide water needs has to be forefront. Okay, that's it.
Okay. And we get to breakout room number 3, and that's, I guess, Rachel.
It sure is. Like I told my group, please pop in the chat if I miss anything. For sure, large themes in terms of inequities that I saw brought up in other breakout rooms that I was in before. But we had a really amazing group of folks there, really great people who are doing some amazing volunteer work with tons of experience in a lot of different areas. So just really appreciate the wisdom and the stewardship that's in that room. In terms of what specific inequities that need to be addressed, I think one of the ones that we spent a lot of time talking about was developer and development versus rural small communities and urban communities as well. Just sort of that power and influence imbalance in terms of the legal power that they have, the money that they have, and the influence that they have on political decision making, and a lot of examples of small communities from Cedar Crest to other areas, really having to fight against some really huge dangers. Another inequity is around water being viewed as a commodity. So everything is sort of viewed as blanket equal, and that's really not how it should be done. So how do we change that? Is it through constitutional amendments? What are other ways to create that paradigm shift? Other things too we talked about was the difference between infrastructure just across for water users. So in rural communities, lack of flood control agencies in Berlin was an example, whereas that's something that we have up in Albuquerque. What else do we have? Also the burden that's placed on small ag and other small groups and not on developers in terms of how we deal with water scarce years. Big discussion around environmental flows on the side of, there's a lot of governmental agencies that have to make decisions almost in a vacuum for the Environmental Species Act, but at the same time, it's really important to consider environmental flows as a way to restore a healthy ecosystem, to, reduce the water loss that comes from, destroyed watersheds, invasive species, et cetera. So that was a really interesting one. It comes as no surprise that nobody loves green grass lawns or golf courses. And, there was also a lot of concern in terms of cannabis as well, but we talked about a just transition from oil and gas, which is a huge water user. So how do you balance that? What do you transition to? Agriculture and habitat restoration, species support, good water quality for everyone was totally agreed upon as essential water usage. Sandra Postal's books were brought up. The Green Amendment was brought up. Discussion around how do we find funding and resources for really good public education. A member of our group had done some really amazing surveys to help garner public comment on water usage, water prioritization in the Midwest. And that seems like we could build on a lot of stuff that's been done in the past here, and really expand public education and public involvement in this. So folks making the decisions are not just a few. And then some good questions for the public, but I'm sure I'm probably going over time, so I will end there. But someone had a question in the group around alternative sharing, and I don't know if there's time for that question to be answered, Bob, or if I should just email. Let me know what I should do with that one.
Why don't we hold that and just continue with the report outs? And it brings us to number 4, which is that Emma or Norm or?
That's me, Bob, thanks. So hi, everyone. My name is Emma Kelly. I work for the Bureau of Reclamation, and I got the privilege of working with some great people today in our small group. So I thank Norm for being our note taker, and I thank our participants, Nancy, Doug, Mona, Mark, Wayne, and Bee. We had a really great, diverse kind of perspectives and backgrounds, and we were all here today because it seems like we care about water and we want to learn. Some of the conversation around the inequities in the Middle Rio Grande for water distribution was really focused on kind of the rural-urban divide and the ag and municipal divide, and how there can maybe be more equitable ways of apportioning water conservation. We identified that there's definitely a need for just education around these issues. And another kind of big inequity that we've spent a lot of time talking about is, post-permit compliance of groundwater use and surface water use. And we had some representatives from the state engineer's office that were really great. And again, kind of highlighted the need that the state engineer and the interstate stream commission offices have for more capacity so that they can do their jobs effectively. Let's see what else. We had some really good discussion about kind of water use, and we had the question, like, are we trying to rank beneficial uses here? And came to the agreement that that's a really hard task, and one that the state engineer does not do. They approach all beneficial uses the same. And we identified some of the real crucial needs moving forward in the future are local food growth, acequia, supporting our cities, having drinking water with jobs and economies, and the river itself as an ecosystem has a really crucial need for our future. Similarly, we questioned some of our uses of water. So green lawns in Albuquerque, maybe alfalfa, looking at maybe there's a need to look at alternative, more productive crops. And then transmission losses was a big one as well, as something that we probably just cannot afford in the future. And then finally, our kind of questions we had, I'd say the biggest one that came to mind or to the table here was, what even is equity? What does that actually look like? And maybe more importantly, like who defines what is equitable? Those are really big questions, and our group doesn't have the answers, and I don't know if this group has the answers to that, but really important in moving this conversation forward is how do we define equity as a society, and who's in the room to do that? And I think it's got to be through listening groups and small conversations like what we have here today. So thank you all.
Okay, and now breakout room number 5 is that Alejandria or
It's actually
Carolyn?
Brittany. Alejandra wasn't able to make it today. I was the facilitator for group 5. And, my group we had a wonderful group of people with lots of wonderful discussion. And most people were joining to listen and learn. There were some initial questions. How do we implement shortage sharing with practicality? Where are the young people in this conversation? How does water quality affect water supply? Those were some of the interesting questions we had for why people were here today. And then specific inequities that we talked about, groundwater versus surface water, where does environmental use come into the picture, and can it be a primary driver for, because it's been placed at the back burner a lot. We talked about water quality. We talked about Pueblo sovereignty and inequities faced by the Pueblo communities and not valuing their input and decisions. And then again, talking about how do we get more young people involved in the conversation. Essential water uses that are crucial to New Mexico's future. Sustainable agriculture. We talked a lot about, how there are certain ways to do agriculture that is, really beneficial, not just for the population, but also for sustainable water supply and recharge for the aquifers. And then there are some unsustainable uses of agriculture, and, maybe those aren't something that we continue doing. We talked about, how are we going to consider developments, like Santolina or Campbell Ranch, endangered species, and water flow for the Rio Grande and its tributaries. And I'm going to turn off my video because it says my internet is unstable. Hopefully that will help. Water uses that we can no longer afford included fresh water for oil and gas production, lawns, potentially dairy farming. We talked about unsustainable agriculture, evaporative losses from open acequias is a potential one. We talked about flood irrigation versus drip, and how oftentimes when flood irrigation is done properly, that it does recharge the aquifer. So there's, some trade-offs there. Recreational uses of the large reservoirs and keeping water in the reservoir for that purpose, which allows for additional evaporation issues. We talked about passing policies that don't take water into consideration, and specifically the more recent cannabis policy, where it felt like water was kind of an afterthought when that was passed. And then, some of the questions that the public may have, does rainwater harvesting hurt recharge? And then the big one for the general public who isn't necessarily part of these conversations or doesn't have a background in water is, why does this matter to me? Why should I be involved? How does my water use impact the general water supply for New Mexico? We had a question on, do we have the data that we need to make decisions? And I think how is that data presented? Do we have some data that is accessible for the general public, like a pie chart of the different types of uses? How does rotational fouling help with water supply? Who will protect people on private wells who can't afford to drill new wells when their wells go dry from, a myriad of other uses? And then just, how do we educate both the public and the policymakers going forward? So those were the majority of our answers. And if I missed anything, please jump in, group members, and let me know. Thank you.
Okay, and now our sixth breakout room.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that-
me.
That's two of
Hi,
you.
yeah, hi everyone. My name's Julia Bernal. I'm from San Diego Pueblo, and I'm the director for Pueblo Action Alliance. It's good to see folks on the call. And Paula, thank you so much for your presentation today. I really enjoyed your perspective. So I was the facilitator for Group 6, and I know we're over time, but in the spirit of equity, I would definitely like to, invite you all to stay on to listen about our discussion. Many of our members in our breakout room, are here today because they have concerns around, water shortage and storage, and essentially, how can we ensure that, those that are land-based and underserved communities are at the table when it comes to decision making around future water uses for the state. There was also a concern of a lack of proposals for new legislation for water. Sometimes water tends to be buried in various agendas, but there is obviously this group is testament to the want to learn about how water administrations work. In terms of specific inequities, there was a nice discussion about how there isn't really a consistent definition of public welfare, and that essentially will, perpetuate inequities around water use in the state of New Mexico, and that, our water agencies are supposed to be a trustee and act in everybody's interest. Although it seems like there have been times where, economic development leans towards money, and then, that causes gaps in equity when it comes to sustainable and equitable economic and community development. There was some conversation around, how can community management also be implemented and how we enforce water laws and water codes. So that way we can start to extract some of like these human elements around ineffective water use. But essentially, this is a balancing act, and that the public welfare should and those requirements should have more teeth in how we're, managing future water uses. I also wanted to talk about, our group talked about infrastructure and how, the infrastructure essentially is a way for us to be more sustainable in our system, to minimize system losses and other types of, crucial ways for us to store our water. Urbanization is a concern because, that ultimately takes up water resources. And then, how is the Middle Rio Grande going to step up in terms of how development is equitable and, laws around development, center community well-being. And also agriculture, one thing I really appreciated that Paula mentioned was, without agriculture, that, if agriculture goes, the river goes, and that's, very apparent just even in my community. Some of the, the ways, some of the water uses that we no longer could afford were definitely mentioned by, previous groups, but I did want to uplift, how oil and gas is no longer sustainable. And also technology industries like Intel are also using incredible amounts of water, which begs the question, are they willing to also share shortages the way that is being pressured onto small traditional water users? There's a lot of movement to incentivize agricultural use, to transfer agricultural use, but is that going to be the same way for technology and industries? And so some of the questions that we left with our group is, how are we going to curtail development, and what's going to happen in that just transition? And how can we ensure that, futures are sustainable and they benefit communities? Again, this is a balancing act. Another was, what governmental agencies do communities trust essentially to make these best decisions? You know, there's long histories of distrust with governmental entities. And so how can we reform that process to center equity and land-based communities? And then, you know, one question that I'll leave with is, you know, how can this organization, the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates, help communities follow specific bills that we can all advocate for in the future to ensure that we're considering equity and, traditional communities and in future water uses. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and thanks to all the facilitators and everybody who was here. Just delighted that you spent your time with us. I'd like to ask that each of us make 2 phone calls, one to our local senator, one to our local representative, and tell them very briefly, water is important and needs resources. And if we can do that, we'll have made some progress. But at that, before we wind up, let me invite Norm to give any closing remarks he sees.
Well, I just want to again thank everybody for joining our conference. The conversations we've had have been very interesting, and the water advocates will be examining, you know, the responses from the breakout groups, and we'll be feeding those back to you. We do have recordings from January 8th now posted. They're on the Water Advocates conference page at the very top, and we're working to get the rest of the recordings of the breakout group presentations also posted. Let me just close with a pitch that there is a system that has been thought through and codified as a rule that's been upheld by the New Mexico Supreme Court to deal with these shortage sharing and water equity issues. And that is active water resources management. You've heard it referred to as AWRM. That's an unfortunate acronym, but let's just use active administration. And there's 2 components to that. And one is that the state engineer should prepare and apply priority administration. When we don't have enough water to go around, our Constitution and our laws say that the state engineer will administer by priority, rather than let us get into the trap of violating the Rio Grande Compact. Priority administration isn't used because it's difficult and because it has very adverse effects. The alternative is also set forth in the rule for active administration. It's called alternative administration, and what it really means is that rather than administer by priorities, the state engineer would accept a shortage sharing agreement for the whole basin that would effectively constrain uses to the available supply. And that would have to be done in a collaborative setting with lots of people involved. We're not doing any of that here now, and I think it's just imperative that we start. So state engineer resources to initiate the active administration processes, to prepare for priority administration, and to support and help facilitated conversation around shortage sharing involving all stakeholders. Those are the 2 steps that I think could help us get out of our emergency. Thank you for being here. We'd love to have you join us. We'll be reaching out to you with other information about how to do that. And I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.